My mother and I have a deep passion for music. We also share in the disappointment at the realization that passion doesn't always translate into talent. Now, if you didn't get that, that is my very nice way of saying that both Mom and I are absolutely tone deaf. So a couple of weeks ago, we're having this conversation on the phone. And as our conversations usually do, we began to talk about music. My mom began by asking me a very simple question. What's your favorite song? It took me about 2 seconds to answer. It's got to be The Sound of Silence. You know, that epic folk song written by the masters Simon and Garfunkel. Now, the song begins with the words, "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I'm here to chat with you once again." Now, admittedly, that song is not the cheerful, peppy, musical piece that you would like to share with Mom. It's actually deep, dark, gloomy, and depressing. And so, as we're talking, I hear a pause on the other side of the line. I can hear my mom still breathing. She wants to continue the conversation. And so she asks another question, a really innocent one. So tell me, Simon, what's your favorite book of the Bible? I stop and hesitate a bit more. Finally, I muster up the courage to say, it's gotta be Job. Again, a pause. The breathing becomes heavier on the other side of the phone line. And finally, my dear old mom decides to break the sound of silence by uttering the words, "This was a great conversation. Call you next week." And she hung up. My mom hung up on me. And what's even more mortifying is that from that moment on, she refuses to pick up my phone calls. And so that got me to thinking, what is it about the book of Job that makes us feel so uncomfortable? Now, I'm not talking about that sanitized version that you might have read about in Sabbath school. You know, that one that starts sounding like a 19th century Brother Grimm's novel that begins in chapter 1 with the words, "Once upon a time in the land of Uz," and concludes in verse 42 in that same chapter with the words, "And the Lord blessed Job, and they lived happily ever after." No, that's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to those 39 chapters that comprise Job's poem of pain. The words in these chapters seem far removed from the piety of the prologue and from the enjoyment of the epilogue. In these chapters, the real question is not, will Job curse God? But rather, it is, where is God? It is these phrases that have pushed Scottish essayist and historian Thomas Carlyle to describe the book of Job as the most beautiful thing ever written with a pen. It is those sentences that have moved countless theologians, pastors, poets, musicians, artists, and lay people to consider a man sitting in silence and solitude at the top of an ash heap, asking the question, why? And so you and I must answer this morning, what is it about that particular book that makes us drawn to it? Perhaps Old Testament scholar J. Hempel has it right when he says that the book of Job is so compelling because it presents the ultimate struggle in life's search for the ultimate meaning of who is God. Maybe you're drawn to the book because you identify with Job. Author Elie Wiesel, talking about the book, says that there is an air of familiarity to the work. Wiesel argues that there is something contemporary, and that is uncomfortable when we look at Job. So whatever reason has attracted you to read the book on occasion, what is undoubtable is that every time you pick it up, you have these competing emotions. You feel both mystified and terrified. Now, today I want to ask you to do something with me. Will you go on a trek that descends into the valley of ashes? As we go, you will find a man sitting outside our sanctuary. This man is far removed from the certainty of our orthodoxy. And as you consider Job, you will have to wrestle with the question, have you regarded my servant Job? So how does the play begin? Well, it starts in the first act with one movement. And the language at the outset is subversive. You see, up until this point, wisdom literature in Israel has functioned under the pretense of retribution theology. The God of said literature is depicted as a divine warrior king who descends to earth and establishes a relationship with humanity. The parameters of the relationship are set up. Those who are loyal will be blessed, and those who are rebellious will be cursed. But you see, that paradigm doesn't quite function when you look at Job, does it? You see, Job forces us to do something uncomfortable. For the book itself will attempt to reconstruct the very origins of creation. In chapter 1 and 2, Job will begin by depicting a series of 6 scenes, heart-wrenching in nature. These scenes alternate from heaven to earth, and they are reminiscent of the 6 days of creation in the Genesis account. Like Adam before him, the Job that inhabits the Edenic land of Uz is a unique man. He is upright and blameless. He has fulfilled the commission to go out and be fruitful and multiply, and has lived a life that is in full harmony with the plan of the cosmic creator. Job is the picture of piety. And what's really tragic and upsetting about the story is that disaster still will strike him. There is an eerie similarity between the wind that makes the house where Job's sons are feasting collapse and that same wind that moves on the top of the fountains of the deep in the book of Genesis. The Hebrew uses the very same word to describe that event. And so as the curtain begins to fall on the first act, we see Job and his companions retreating into silence. Intermission comes, and so now the audience must deal with a question. We must wrestle with a new notion. The idea that unmitigated pain forces you and I to recognize that something has changed in heaven and on earth. Desperately, we await for the curtain to rise up, for the second act to begin. At the edge of our seats, we hope to hear the lips of Job open. For we expect him to be delivered from the mournful silence that the 6 scenes of destruction in chapter 1 and 2 have pushed him into. Maybe there's even a hope of a 7th scene, in which Job will open his mouth and cry out with joy in a wonderful Sabbath celebration. But as the curtain is lifted, we find Job, and he is sitting on a heap of ashes. He opens his mouth, but the words that he uses are words of curse toward a creation that is no longer very good. It's a difficult read. It's painful. You see, because the language of praise in these 39 chapters has been supplanted by the grammar of protest. Job is entering into a difficult scenario. Author Doris Betts probably puts it best when she tells the story of a young girl, a girl whose faith was unsettled by the blasphemous pronouncements of Granville. You see, Granville had gone off to college, and while he was at university, he discovered that a lot of the beliefs that he held to be near and dear were now open to criticism. Now, let me open a parenthesis and just tell you that Granville did not attend Loma Linda or La Sierra University. But nonetheless, the young girl in Betts' story feels like she should be able to counteract the statements of Granville until something happens. She begins to feel an air of uneasiness creeping inside as she recognized that perhaps, just perhaps, Granville may know something about faith that she still remains oblivious to. Reflecting on the ruminations of the young girl, Betts writes, "Each of his words was like a splinter that dug deep inside me. It created a sore in each place that it penetrated me. After not too long, my religion was untouchable. But I still preferred the soreness of the splinters to the painful operation of removing them." You see, Job has begun to engage in this painful operation. Language of praise will not suffice, for he is ready to launch into a full frontal assault on all of creation. If Yahweh will begin the order of the cosmos by saying, "Let there be light," Job will say in chapter 3, verse 4, "Let there be darkness. Let the day itself perish." Are you feeling uncomfortable yet? Because we sometimes rush to judge Job until we realize that his pronouncements are driven by a question that every one of us who has experienced at some point in life pain now asks. You know the question. Why? 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 How many times have you asked that? And then Job's desire for darkness itself to engulf the day of his birth is the result of a man that has begun to wrestle with the notion that perhaps, and just perhaps, the pain and suffering that you and I experience on this planet may be too high a toll to pay for existence. I think Robert Frost puts it best in his poem, The Question. Frost writes, "Look me in the stars and tell me now, men of earth, if all the soul and body scars are too steep a price to pay for birth." Job is asking these questions. And as he asks them, the curtain in the second act begins to drop. And we are left with discomfort. You see, we are feeling uneasy. We are not comfortable with this particular language. Our faith confessions have no space for the protests of Job. As the lights dim, we see Job in the darkness, attempting to conjure up the great monster of chaos, Leviathan, in order to replace the fowl and the fish. He is desperately yearning for the only Sabbath rest that he can find: the tomb, the grave. In essence, Job has replaced the womb for the tomb, as he gallantly attempts to revert to the very order of creation. He curses. But let's get it right this morning. This isn't a mere exercise in grief recovery. You see, in the Jewish mindset, to utter a curse is to set in motion a series of events that articulate the very desires of the one who curses. Job has no more use for this creation. And so he attempts to construct something dark and foreign. As the curtain lifts on the third act, so does our discomfort. We are now through the roof. You see, I can almost see Job's friends. They've been silent up to this point. But now, now they're shaking, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. After all, if Job proves that creation itself is senseless, then my world collapses. Speech loses its meaning. The very structures that provide purpose for existence begin to buckle and bend under the blight of this man. This cannot be. This will not be. And so Job's companions go into their theological toolboxes and they dust off the tried and true methods of retribution theology. They declare him guilty and demand a confession. But throughout the whole time, Job continues to relentlessly plead his innocence. Until chapter 38. You see, at this moment, God appears and speaks out of the whirlwind in a desperate attempt to make Job realize that human beings tend to see the world as an extension of themselves. And that causes us to assume a position at the very center of creation. Through his conversation in the whirlwind, Yahweh is reminding Job, that crisis in my personal world, that pain and suffering in my circle does not equate to chaos in the whole created order. The sun continues to rise, the earth to rotate. And then God is once again silent. And the reader, those brave voyagers that have decided to take a trek into the valley of ashes, must ask a question. And it's a rather simple one. You must today decide if there is a place for Job's language of protest in our faith confessions. I believe there is. Because I believe firmly that pain necessitates a voice. And that voice is a messy juxtaposition of anguish. The curse that seeks to negate the experience. Oh, and that lament. That lament that relentlessly looks for meaning, even when the search makes no sense. This is what is truly heroic about Job. Reminds me of a novel written by American author Rod Cornley. It's titled Beach Music. It describes the story of a man, Jack McCall. McCall lives in Rome. He's a widower and has just recently returned to Charleston, South Carolina to attempt and pick up the pieces of his life. His mother, Lucy, besieged by leukemia, is now reflecting on the suffering lot that has befallen her family. She says, "Oh, how I wish that life would have taught us all the lessons, and that I could have learned to avoid these traps during my childhood. But the world doesn't work like that, Jack. Because pain doesn't travel in a straight line. It encircles us. It sneaks up behind us. It's the circles that kill you." So I ask again, is there a place for Job's language of protest in our community of faith? Well, maybe there is. Because maybe the real problem is that we, averse to discomfort, have created a circular faith. A faith where it is okay to praise, but it's not okay to lament. A faith where it's okay to affirm, but it's never okay to question. A faith where you can trust, but you can never doubt. And I ask myself, how efficient is this faith ministering to those Jobs that sit on these pews beside us? Are the songs that we sing and the sermons that we preach comforting them? You see, maybe the real purpose of the book of Job is not to provide answers to the questions that continue to dog our faith. Maybe the purpose is to give us an assurance that no matter how far you have fallen in the valley of the shadow of ash, you are not walking alone. Isn't it beautiful that Job cries, protests, curses, but he does so always with the optimism of a child that believes that God is there listening? And in that sense, maybe Job has become more than just a man. Maybe Job is in the canon because he represents the whole of humanity. And if this is the case, I want to be a part of a race that thinks like that. I want to be part of a race that feels like that. I want to be part of a race that prays like that, because that kind of race deserves a dialogue with the divine. Because that kind of race deserves a conversation with the Creator. This is who Job is. So what do we do with the discomfort? How do we navigate the book? How do we ensure that we arrive at a safe port? I haven't figured it out yet. Because the book of Job is not about providing answers. It is about calling you and I to continue asking that same question, why, relentlessly. Because as we ask this question faithfully, maybe God will begin to reveal himself throughout the changes that we experience in the midst of an answering silence. At the end of the book, God says, "My servant Job has spoken rightly about me." Maybe the best thing that we do is sing, even from the valley of ash, as we look up and we say, "God, how great thou art." May God bring you comfort.